So I am really delighted to be starting our May-June issue, Conversations with the Editor. Look at this gorgeous cover. So the whole theme for this issue is threshold places, which you can think of as well as sort of transitions, the major transitions that we go through, that Earth goes through, that we share collectively, that we go through individually. So when we started thinking about putting this issue together, we started with the big themes. We started with ideas around life and death.
Mm.
And the person that I'm speaking to this morning, very welcome, Ruth, is Ruth Sidgwick from Bristol, who I first met at the Resurgence Summer Camp last year, 2023. And Ruth, at the end of summer camp, we have something called open sessions where people who have gathered for the weekend, it's just a fantastic weekend, might want to bring some expertise or an offering to the group before we part. And Ruth very kindly came and offered an open session to introduce us to the idea of death cafes. So the article that we have, the headline is Tea, Cake and Death. Really talks about, it's an interview by Katie Dancy-Down, one of our writers, with Ruth and with her colleague Dee Riding. Dee is not very well, unfortunately not able to be with us today, but we have Ruth. Ruth, you are very, very welcome. Enough talking from me. We're going to get into the topic of talking about death. So I'm going to ask you first to just share with us, in case people haven't had a chance to see this article yet, what's the idea behind the death cafes? What are they?
It's a global idea, which is fantastic. So Death Cafes was started by the lovely John Underhill in 2011. So they've been going for a long time. And it is the idea of having a space which feels safe, in which one can talk about death and dying. It's not a bereavement support group. So that's one thing it's not. That's about the only rule. And it is about having people coming together and feeling that they can have death-positive conversations. They can talk about their fears about death. They can ask practical questions about death. They can just sit and listen. It can be so hard to have those conversations about that final passage, that final rite of passage that we all know we're going through. It's the one thing that unites us all. We have really lost a lot of contact with the idea of death in our society. And it feels as though once upon a time, before Victorian funeral directors took precedence, it would be the women in the household that would look after the body of someone who had died. They would be caring for someone as they died. There would be much more control. With the advent of the Victorian funeral director, that control was taken away from people, from their families, and was put up into the hands of funeral directors on the high street. So, and I'm a funeral director on the high street, but with Dee has set up a progressive funeral directors, which is about putting families at the centre of what happens. And part of that is having the conversation about death and dying. And we understand how incredibly hard that can be, because of course it confronts all our own fears about our own death, our intimations of mortality. So a death cafe is that safe space to have that gentle conversation that you perhaps can't have with your family. So even your closest loved ones, you may just feel it's too much for them to bear. So we invite people in. There are a couple of other rules. There's always tea, there's always cake, and it's a safe space. So whatever goes on in the death cafe, those conversations are confidential. And we ask people to be respectful, to listen to what people need to say. Because the other thing about death is that everybody feels it in a different way. There's no such thing as a common approach to grief. We know that people might go through certain stages. Those may happen all at once. Some of them may not happen for years, or they may get stuck into an anger or a denial stage, which can be very common, or people may move through them very quickly. So people can come along to a death cafe and just ask the questions that they might be thinking about at 3 o'clock in the morning when they feel isolated, or in those darkest moments when you're thinking, what does it feel like to die, and how can I make that transition, the big transition, with more ease? What do I need to know about palliative care, about pain management? Who can help me through that? And also the questions about what happens once someone has died. What choices do I have as a partner, or a daughter, or a son, or a family, a mother or a father? How can I negotiate that, the minefield of questions and jobs that need to be done? How can I do that and have some agency in what happens to my loved ones? So it's a really broad subject.
It is, but one of the statements in the article itself makes a reference to you and Dee explaining to the writer that actually the deaf cafes are about reclaiming that conversation. And I think you've just described that very well for us. So it's a conversation, let me kind of summarize, kind of conversation that people may feel nervous about having, scared about having, maybe unsure how to start, unsure what options they might have.
Yep.
Not wanting to upset family members and people who love you. Very difficult. I'm just going to share that I came into the open session because I have people in my life who have quite threatening health diagnoses, and so it's kind of crept in and played on my mind a lot about how I can be supportive, but also kind of deal with my own thoughts about that. I really benefited from listening. You had 30, 40 people came into that session. So that told me something as well about how these conversations need to find a place to take place. But when I left, I realised I hadn't had those conversations myself. And I have to say, and I'm very proud of myself, that in the year that has elapsed since, I have done everything that I would want to do. And that included actually doing a living will and working out how I could, make sure that was respected. And I wear a little ID bracelet that says I have a living will. So all of those steps. And as this piece says, I think you quoted in the piece saying, it can be very hard for people to talk about their own wishes around their own death. So you have the two sides, don't you? Have the death of those we love and care about, and then, of course, the thought of your own mortality. But what you say, and this is a quote, and I loved this, is we think it's going to be really painful, like a stinging thing, but actually just grasp the nettle because it can be less awful than you think. And for me, that definitely proved to be the case. It was not as awful as I thought. It was actually really empowering in lots of ways. And my main thing was, what I felt very strongly about is no one will have to sort any mess out if I'm not here, because it's sorted out.
Yes. Yes. And so there are so many things that come out of that, Susan, that, well, firstly, a friend of mine, she and her sister in their 60s fell out about what was to happen to their mother when she died. So the sister was convinced that the mother wanted a religious funeral. My friend knew that there was no way that she would have wanted a religious funeral. And they fell out about it. It's just not worth that anxiety. And I was a funeral celebrant before I was a funeral director. And I know that working with families who had had those conversations before someone had died, it eased their grief. It doesn't lessen the grief, but it takes some of that terrible pain out of decision making, as Dee said, when you're in the white heat of grief, so that you're people often die unexpectedly, and people are left reeling. And, well, what did they want? Did they want a willow coffin or an all singing, all dancing casket? Did they want a wake, or did they want and suddenly they're absolutely steamrolled by grief, and then they're having to make all these choices, and they have no guidance about that. So I know that making the decisions that you have made for yourself, Susan, will make life so much easier for your family and your friends. And of course, you can always say, actually, here's a list of choices about the kind of music I'd like played, or, well, I might like a willow coffin, but do I want a bright pink one or a rainbow one? Or actually, these are some of the choices I'd like. but actually for my children, it's up to you. Or for my partner, you decide, but within some parameters.
Yeah, so the thing for me there would be like the detail for me is not particularly important, but the decision around whether someone I was buried or cremated is really important because I feel very strongly about that. So they will be in no doubt about that. What they do subsequently is up
Yes.
to them. I haven't been particularly prescriptive because I don't feel strongly about that. But I think my point and the reason I'm sharing the personal thing is it's only because I came to your taster session of the Death Cafe in a field in Worcestershire at the end of our camp that I really took this on board. If I had not done that, I might have let another year go by, maybe another year go by, because it's just easier to kind of look the other way, isn't it? So I think for us, like this was a really important part of our thresholds. As you said right at the beginning, Ruth, it is a threshold, it's a transition that we will all, without exception, make at some point. But it is particularly in many cultures, our cultures now, completely shrouded in, ignorance actually, and lack of willingness to even think about it. And I celebrate the Death Cafes for opening up that space. And I noticed when I came to your session, yes, indeed, it wasn't about processing grief at all. And you were very clear about that. But people brought all sorts, didn't they, into that space?
They really did. And to have 40 people there, it was nearly 40 people. That was a lot of people. And the format with the Death Cafe tends to be quite relaxed. So we would start a session by going around and everybody sharing their name and what brought them to today's Death Cafe. Yeah. And that then gives us a whole, a collection of issues that are so diverse. And then somebody will say, oh, actually, I wanted to find out about power of attorney. What you said is really interesting. What do we do about it? Or why would we consider a green burial over cremation? What are the pros and cons? And what's the environmental footprint of a green burial compared to a cremation? Or what do I feel about the end of my life and the palliative care that I might want and the amount of pain control? All those questions, which are quite big, can actually lose some of that power and that fear if you share it in a room where everybody's understanding that actually we are all going to face this. It'll be different for each of us, but we've explored it, and it does take some of that fear out of it, that sting out of it.
So can I ask you two final things, Ruth, please? The first is how can people go about finding a Death Cafe in their own local area? And I'm assuming because yours in North Bristol is, I'm assuming these are offline, they're in person.
They're a mixture. So first of all, it's really great to go to deathcafe.com, and that covers Death Cafes across the world. So you'll find them in South America, North America, Australia, Europe, UK, and you just type in your postcode or your city, and then you can find out the ones that are nearest to you. So in Bristol, we have 2 Death Cafes running. We have North Bristol, which is an evening face-to-face, and then we also have the Bristol Death Cafe, which runs on a Sunday, and it takes each month, it's either online or the following month it's in person. So we've tried to keep them at different times so that people can access them in different ways.
Right. And then just the final thing is, would you share with us, and thank you so much for contributing to this issue, the May June issue, the idea of this threshold that is going to happen to all of us. But would you share for us, Ruth, what's the most rewarding thing about your work in this space? It's quite a personal question.
It's so rich. We meet such interesting people, and people are at a moment of extraordinary change, often extraordinary pain, and to be able to walk alongside them through that, to handhold them through it, to spend time with them whilst they're making decisions, showing options to them about what might make that funeral, that service, their thinking about it easier. It's a huge privilege. So, I feel incredibly lucky that we're a team of 5 here. We happen to be all women, and We all call ourselves very death positive. We talk about death all the time. We have a lot of fun as well. We have a lot of laughs about it. And people have said this about the Death Cafe, that it's not all gloomy, that once you've got over that sort of, ooh, it's really difficult to talk about because it's so hard, I'm going to die one day, and actually it's also very good humoured. We have a lot of laughs, and we have a couple of people who come every single month because they say it's the most rewarding evening out of their month.
Well, I think that
I'm great to be involved in that.
You couldn't have a higher recommendation, could you? I know in the article, actually, the writer says that somebody who has gone along says, well, I know this sounds strange, but it was like going to the pub and having a really good evening, except we have tea and cake. Ruth, I just want to thank you so much for finding the time to chat with us today. Are you planning on being at summer camp this year, 2024?
I can't wait. I had such a great experience last year. It's a regular feature of my calendar now, and I'm really, really pleased to be able to offer a death cafe, and please come along and just have a chat or just sit and listen.
So I'm going to thank you in advance for that, because I definitely will be sitting on that hay bale. Or was it a straw bale? I think it's a straw bale, isn't it? Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you for your time. I shall look forward to seeing you in July. And for anybody who is looking for some more details on summer camp, go to our website, resurgence.org. I think the details are all up there. Thank you, Ruth. Take good care.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.